Welcome back to Map Camp. This is our second session today. I'm delighted to say we've got three truly wonderful speakers, Marcus, Rosa and Alistair. Now, I'm not going to tell you who's who. One runs a consultancy company in Moscow, uses Wardley maps to help medium-sized commercial organizations compete more effectively, and also lectures at the National University of Science and Technology in Moscow itself on the topics of complexity and, of course, on mapping. Now, one is a postdoctoral research fellow at London School of Economics, interested in social and organizational implications of digital innovation and the politics of technology, has actually conducted research on Wardley maps, which have been presented at conference and is being published in an academic journal. And lastly, we have not least, head of analytics machine learning at a famous leading British law firm, who happens to be a senior teaching fellow on business analytics at UCL School of Management, and also teaches technology strategy on the Beijing International MBA, which is actually at Peking University. So amazing lineup of speakers. Today we're going to talk about why didn't I learn this at business school. Before we get started, quick introductions. And so Marcus, which one are you?
Not the UCL School of Management, because I think there's a giveaway answer.
There is a bit of a giveaway, isn't there?
I'm based in Moscow, so I'll introduce myself a little bit more in the presentation, but I'm the Moscow-based, not consultant. We do not use that word.
Oh, sorry, guide. My apologies. Guide, right, guide. Perfect, so my apologies there. Rosa, a process of elimination.
Somebody was asking about my background. It's not really a map, but a good point. It could be a map. It's Joan Miró. I'm from Barcelona, originally Joan Miró as well, but now I'm based at the London School of Economics, and I'm a researcher, and I'm a researcher in a research project that I'm going to talk about in the presentation.
Wonderful, wonderful. And finally, Alistair, that by process of elimination and the fact that you've got it plastered on your screen in big letters.
I don't have the LSE insignia behind me. So I work at a law firm called Mishkondareya, and I teach in the UCL School of Management, amongst other things.
A pleasure. Now, thank you ever so much for coming along. The way this works is each of our speakers will speak for 15 minutes, and then we'll have a Q&A session with the other two speakers to discuss what's been presented, and then the next speaker for 15 and 15-minute discussion, then the next speaker, 15-minute discussion. You'll find for people attending, there is a Q&A section, so please put your questions in there so I can throw those in, because I'll be moderating, and the running order today is Marcus, and then Rosa, and then Alistair. Now, I'm hidden in a marsh. It's possible my network will go down. If it does, just you continue, fascinating enough. You don't need me and my blah, blah, blah. And at that point, I'm just going to say, I'm going to go on mute, and I'm going to throw the ball over to Marcus. Away you go, Marcus.
Okay, thank you. So I'll just share my screen. So my presentation, so my presentation is called PST-KAI. What the flip is that? So firstly, a bit of context. I'm English, but I'm based in Moscow, Russia, where I run a company called Power Maps, which is essentially Wardley maps in Russian, but there's no W sound in Russian, so people struggle to always pronounce Wardley here, so we named it something else. I'm a graduate of Warwick Business School, where on my very last course, there was one day given over to Dave Snowden, who walked in and said, forget everything they're teaching you on your MBA. It's not going to help you in the complex world out there. And Dave was right. Why didn't I learn things like real strategy at business school? Why didn't I learn about the usefulness of maps? But what I really want to talk about today is pioneer, settler, and town planner. So I think most of you are probably familiar with this doctrine. It's a way of organizing. The reason I'm interested in it is that it's a way of organizing organically around the way people are, rather than how we wished they were. Now, the pioneer, settler, and town planner model is very appealing to me, and I think it's very appealing to a lot of people, and the organizations that we work with are also very interested in this quite early. There's just one problem with it. Simon keeps telling people don't do it, and I'm pitching him here as the angry cat saying, you can't handle PST. So there's a very good reason for that. And that's because before you get to the idea of there is no one culture, you need to do all of this other stuff first. You need to think in aptitude and attitude. You need to think small. You need to know your users and you need to know their needs. And you also need to know things like use appropriate tools and have situational awareness. And for that, you need a common language. And the problem with that is that that's going to take most organizations years. So now I'm picturing Angry Cat as the CEO of a company saying, well, I haven't got years to fix this mess. I want PST now. And that's because most CEOs have also been to the same business schools we have and have also been taught this type of stuff, which Dave Snowden pops up and says, it's not going to help you in a complex world. So we know what we want when we see it. We want PST. And we know when we want it, which is kind of, that's the Dougals of the world now going, we want it now. So what do? That's the perennial Russian question. From Tolstoy, what must we do? To Lenin, what is to be done? And it's far beyond that as well. So what must we do if we want PST? Well, I'm going to try to answer that with a real life story. And I have changed the names to protect the innocent and to protect the guilty as well. So this is the situation. There's an organization that we're engaged with called, let's call them Valley Tupper. They're a European and UK based organization. And the situation is that they are a household name with an enviable brand recognition. They design, manufacture and distribute high-end TV and audio goods. 80% of the business in the UK, which is a turnover of about £400 million. And the complication is market dynamics have resulted in a loss of market share. Nothing that they've done, just pure market dynamics, of course. So to salvage margins, costs were cut, and that gave them a temporary reprieve. But by the time we were speaking to them, they were bleeding £1 million a month in losses. So their solution was to bring in a superstar CEO from an international market leader. That's obviously not the superstar's real picture. And he came in promising to lead Valley Tupper to the broad, sunny uplands, which he'd done before. So his first step was to bring in a new executive team of big hitters, and he ran a series of initial retreats to gain buy-in to his new vision. So he hired a smart facilitator, a person I know, Dr. Ewan Jenkins, and he hired me to come in to train them in mapping. He wanted me to train them in landscape and climate so they had some idea of the current landscape. So this was a 2-day engagement. I was there for 2 half days. So the first day I was there, I watched Dr. Jenkins do his work, and he really focuses on the spectrum of problem-solving styles, especially amongst leaders. So at one end, we have the preference for the highly structured, low-risk, efficient approaches to problem-solving, where people want the right equipment and everything else before they do things. And at the other extreme, we have those with the preference for novelty, for risk-taking and out-of-the-box thinking. So for this, he uses something called Curtin's adaptation innovation theory. And I'm smiling because it took me weeks to stop calling it Crichton's adaptation innovation theory. It's Curtin. And this is based from the work of Michael Curtin, who is a cognitive psychologist who outlined a theory of cognition that we all have a favored approach to problem solving. And he developed a 33-question inventory, which allows individuals to discover their preferred style. And this is research that's accompanied by over 200 publications, over 70 theses. And he suggested that all individuals lie on a creativity continuum between those who are high adapters and those who are high innovators. And what he said is that all are creative. They're just creative in different ways. And importantly, we need both in order to survive. So this is Curtin's cognitive continuum, from the creative adaptators on the left, so people who prefer to find solutions using established systems, to the people on the right who are the creative innovators, those who prefer to find new and untested answers to problems. So the executive team of Valley Tupper all completed the 33 question inventory, just takes 15 minutes, and their scores were plugged into this spectrum. Now this spectrum, rather strangely to me, goes from 32 to 160. But those people who are 32 are relatively more adaptive. Those who are the other end are relatively more innovative, whilst the mean, or 67% of any population, is going to be in the middle. So it's a normal standard bell curve. So what you can see from here, from the executive team, and clearly these are also not their photographs, is that they are relatively more innovative as a team. And so Dr. Jenkins' conclusion from this was, well, this team is likely going to slash and burn the past to set them free, because there's an absence of any adapters within this team who are providing the challenge. They also had what he described as the CEO problem. Now, the CEO with a KAI score of 119 had a preferred innovation style, and he'd been very successful with this style in a previous organization because that organization had been blessed with arch adapters. And these were the ones who provided the processes, the comms, logistics he needed to be successful. But these retreats that he was pulling his new executive team into were not so much to get buy-in from them, but they were to get acquiescence to his vision. And the resistance from the executive team, and it was palpable, it was subtle, but it was absolute. They, as a team, were frustrated at being forced to accept the CEO's vision with no opportunity to develop their own. And let's not forget, they're all innovative as well. They all have ideas and visions and creativity. They also felt really threatened that the CEO was expecting them to be his arch adapters who would need to do the execution. And none of them in their very successful careers to date had to do this because they were always the innovators. So jumping forward 6 months, half of that executive team resigned, and the organization made minimal progress before it was overwhelmed by a series of shocks, which was not just limited to COVID. So for Dr. Jenkins and I, the sessions that we did were very frustrating. And so we debriefed and we debriefed and we debriefed. And then as we were debriefing after these sessions, an idea popped into our mind, as it does when you debrief in this way. Doesn't KAI look a little bit like pioneer, settler, and town planner if we switch the pioneers and town planners around? But that was the end of my engagement. So I flew back to Russia, and then I started doing what I was often doing before coronavirus, and I was going out to events and spreading the gospel of Wardley maps in Russian. This is an event that was attended. This was me presenting an event where a managing director of a company attends that here in Moscow. And the managing director had heard of Wardley maps, but wanted to check whether Power Maps, which is what we were advertising, was the same thing, but just happened to be in Russian, and they are. And so after a few discussions, we agreed that we would take this company, and we'll call it Kutuzov because that was the metro station where they're nearby, where they're located. We're going to take them around the strategy cycle, and that's what we do for organizations here. And so this company, Kutuzov, is a market leader in logistics, direct sales and marketing, operates in 15 countries, European head office, but 80% of revenue comes from operations in the Russian-speaking countries, which is managed out of Moscow and headed up by the managing director. So during workshop 2 of the 3 that we do, pioneer, settler, and town planner appears. And at the time, we were not translating pioneers and settlers and town planners, we were translating them more as commandos, army, and police. And this led to a discussion at the end of workshop 2, where the finance director went, "I'm a commando." To which the managing director went, "No, you're not." But that led to a further discussion because now we've got a little bit of a common language and it starts to surface some issues. The MD says, well, look, our owner's brilliant, but frustratingly, he flies in with new ideas. Everybody has to scramble every time. Maybe that's because he's a pioneer. But when he flies out again, I'm left getting main operations back on track again. So maybe I'm a settler. And also the MD admitted that they were having some conflict with the European CEO who seems to keep stepping on their toes, and that's creating conflict and it's creating inefficiencies. Maybe he's another settler. So then I was asked, is there any way of testing this? Debrief, idea. We contact Dr. Jenkins, who's a Welshman in Canada, always points out he's a Welshman. I think mainly that's just to distinguish, to make sure no one confuses him with being English. And he said, yeah, absolutely, we can test those. 15 minutes, and this is the kind of results that you get. That's actually my KAI score. So we plug those for the executive team into the KAI spectrum, and we see the owner is, you know, really quite innovative, and the rest of the team, especially the MD and CEO, have a very similar score. So we translate this into the pioneer, settler, and town planner. And what we see is that, you know, the owner really does seem to be a pioneer. You have a couple of settlers in the middle, the CEO and the MD. The finance director isn't a commando. He's much more towards a town planner. And Dr. Jenkins said, well, look, this is excellent diversity because you've got a real spectrum covering the entire map, as long as that diversity is valued and it's exploited. Because the more diverse the team, the more diverse the moves you can start to consider. And that's where we saw what we called the COO challenge. Now, the COO had completed his KAI results, and you can tell from these results that he was projecting more of an innovative attitude than he really does have. Even though his score was very much adaptive, it was probably even more adaptive than this. And that's because the organization is really defined by the owner, and to get on and succeed, people are emulating what they think they need to be, which is innovative. So we try to point out that absolutely let the owner keep being the man who goes and discovers new sources of gold. You've got some great settlers in the organization who are the ones that are setting up and operating the gold mine. But don't forget that it's going to be the COO who's most likely to open a factory selling shovels, and that's going to be perhaps your future revenue streams. You can be searching for gold and selling shovels at the same time. So we try to show them rather that they could perhaps start adopting PST from the top down, and allowing each of the leaders to focus on their part of the map. So the owner is no longer just the owner, but it's a chief pioneer. So when he flies in, there are teams that have the same kind of attitude who can be mobilized to work with him. That gives freedom for the chief settler, the managing director, to make sure that that's slightly kept away from main operations. But also when these new ideas are developed, the managing director can take them. If they're no good, throw them away, and if they're good, commercialize them. And we can now start to get the chief town planner, instead of trying to emulate the innovator that the owner is, can start to focus on industrialization certain components. Critical to this was that now we could show the CEO that he needs to get away from the chief settler's domain, because he needs to be in control of the entire map. He needs to be seeing the end-to-end stuff. So this seemed to resonate with the managing director and the team. So they asked us to do more KAI assessments. We did the European headquarters, those in green. We did the Russian team, and we can see there's a bit of a split there. We seem to here have an innovative head office who are pioneers, and the Russian office seems to be more settlers and town planners. And that's quite advantageous, because you have innovation from the top team, which is being ably supported by the Russian operations team. And now they have a much greater appreciation of each other's skills and what each other demands in terms of communication and their decision-making approaches and their creativity. So our insight from this is that, you know, you probably can start to do PST from a top-down perspective, you know, to improve governance and to start putting into motion the principle that there is no one culture. So for those Dougalls out there amongst us who want PST, yay, we can do it. We just have to start ignoring the Father Teds who might go down with this sort of thing. So of course, this is a very weak hypothesis. And so we need more data. We need to be testing this more. But I asked the managing director to give me a quote for this presentation. I think the managing director is actually on this call. And the quote was, well, you know, for years since they're doing their own MBA, they've been thinking about how to create an ambidextrous organization, but have never succeeded in achieving it. So now they know there's a way, and the team feels the same. So for anybody interested in exploring KAI, I spoke to Dr. Jenkins. He's created a page there that you can go on to. There's a 20% discount using the MapCamp code if anybody wants to test their own. And I just want to leave you with a final thought, because this also came from our engagement with, and something that the managing director said, which really stuck with me, was, you know, maybe business schools did teach us something after all, because maybe doing an MBA enabled both the managing director, me, to immediately recognize the power of Wardley maps when we first heard about it. And if that's the case, well, then there's a recommendation for business schools, and I did learn something after all. So that's all from me. So thank you for listening.
Wow. Fantastic, Marcus. And what a quote to end with as well. I mean, so just give you a little bit of background on the PST. So originally, when I was running a company for Tango, I knew of the Salomon Story Innovation Paradox 2002, which is basically you've got to be innovative and efficient at the same time. And the problem is back in 2003, I tried to organize in two parts, split it into sort of like the new development and then the sort of core engineering. And that had fragmented the organization, created almost utter warfare between the two groups. It was quite funny, 10 years later, I had Gartner talking about bimodal. Yeah, we did that, and 10 years beforehand, it was a disaster. And the reason why it was a disaster is the Salomon Story Innovation Paradox. You've got the two extremes, a bit like the KII. But I like it, the fact that it's a spectrum, because you've got the bit in the middle, the missing middle. And so what I'd done is reinforce the ends, not the middle, which had created that warfare. Now, I took the ideas actually, and I acknowledge this in many places, from Robert X. Cringsley's Accidental Empires, because he talked about companies, three types of companies. Commandos, infantry, and police is the terms he used. And I realized actually my company was all three of those. It wasn't one thing, it was all three. I had three internal teams. So I applied it all to one company. I added in cell-based structures because that's what you need to make it work. And you need all the other things of doctrine, understanding the user needs, etc. Added in the characteristics which came out of it, and critically the system of theft. And all of those bits became PST. And it sort of worked for me. But as I say to people, well, it worked very well for me. It's difficult to apply if you haven't put the other doctrine in place. If you haven't got that in there, every time I've seen people try and do it without understanding their landscape, it's been a disaster. Anyway, sorry, that's enough blah blah from me. Rosa, Alistair, any questions to fire over to Marcus?
Yeah, in fact, something I wonder is the relationship between these different groups of people. So you were talking about a range of planners, and also Simon was referring to it. What is the relationship with it, between them? That's something I will try and talk about later in my presentation. How do you deal with the connections between one another when they kind of specialize on their profiles within organizations or across organizations?
Well, that's a good question. So Dr. Jenkins explained to me that the key number is 20 on the KAI score. So if within a range of 20, you have a kind of common perspective on things. You already have a natural common language. Once you start to go beyond that, it starts to be a struggle. Now, this example of the company I gave, they've been working together for about 20 years. So they're talented people, they know each other, and they've had success together, so they can overcome those differences. But once you start to get into the very wide range, then things can actually start to fall down unless you have a common task that you're working on. So it's that spectrum of, you do need most of them. And I would also turn around, and I don't want to turn around and go from pioneer settlers and town planners to adding on 4 and 5, but we think the bridges are quite important between pioneers and settlers. But it's all relative. It's not an absolute, it's relative to your organization. You want that spectrum. But yeah, once you go beyond 20 on that score, you're struggling to kind of see things and you're having to work a little bit harder. And that's why I think the advantage of a map is now you can see the part of the organization you're focused on. And if it's the opposite to the town planner, well, let him focus on his and I'll focus on mine. And we're both doing the same kind of thing. As long as you have a CEO who or a leadership team that can see the entire thing and manage it as a map. The map is the key thing here. So people can see they're all working on the same thing. And I just go back to Simon's point as well about kind of PST. Yes, definitely you need to do all these things. But what I'm trying to propose here is that taking it from the top level could actually be a forcing or a forcing function within the organization, that leadership is at least starting to understand that. And that's why this organization asked for more KAIs to understand more of their pioneers, settlers and town planners. And we're hoping that they start to kind of keep that in mind when they're hiring and when they're planning resources, not as an absolute, but as another data point in terms of recruitment, another data point in terms of resourcing. So just maybe that's one way. I don't think the doctrine is phase 1, then 2, then 3, then 4. It is, but I think you can start doing some of those other things, you know, in baby steps to start with as well. But that's perhaps another presentation for another day.
Alistair, you seem deep in thought, pondering on the edge of a question.
I haven't thought at any great length about pioneer settler town planner in some sense, and I realise it's sort of characterised as a sociogram, or the way that, you know, sets of people or sets of skills perhaps manifest. But I also tend to think in an organisation that you can equally sort of characterise the projects and sets of projects teams, and therefore actually you can have someone fulfil a pioneer, a settler and a town planner role depending on, you know, the hour of the day sort of thing. And so I guess where I've done it at all, I've less thought about the skill set side of things and more about the state of the project within the map. You know, how dependent is it on a set of components below it, etc.
So that's fabulous, because
that's an observation rather than a question.
Well, no, I mean, it's a fabulous observation, because what I did back in 2005 is I used the maps to identify the state of projects, and then we reorganized pioneers around that area, settlers around this area. That's why I reorganized it into basically a chief pioneer, chief settler, chief town planner. We've got a question also from the audience here. How much discussion, this is from JT Wall, how much discussion have you had on how these 3 types of groups interact and work together? How much of the interaction is organic and how much is forced through organizational structures and operating models?
So this is an ongoing engagement. So it's still a work in progress. And this was work done before the lockdown, and we're actually now meeting on Friday to carry on discussing with the client. So probably not able to answer that, but if I can answer it in a roundabout way and go back to Alistair's point, it isn't about saying you're a pioneer, therefore you only do this. It is about the projects. But Dr. Jenkins gave me an example of one of the lowest scores, and lowest doesn't mean good or bad, just one of the most adaptive scores was somebody who scored 42. That's very, you know, it's quite extreme. It's a bell curve, so this is kind of like very extreme. And she was managing an R&D department. And he said, that's just the opposite thing to what you should be doing. But she was brilliant because she had huge amount of skills. The aptitude was there. It just meant that it took more out of her than it needed to take out of her. She could do it because she's built up those skills. But if she was in a role that was more suited to her with teams and that problem solving, it would have just been far less stressful, far more comfortable. So I think it's not about saying this is where you are and this is where you can't go. It's about finding that idea of organizing around the way people are. And so it's just a guide to doing that. And that's what we're advising the organization is, you know, don't drop everybody into different groups today. Look at your map and then say, these people are going to be more inclined to do that. And the score may help you understand, like the FD said, I'm a commando. No, you're not. You're taking on tasks which necessarily wouldn't have been great for him.
So just to re-emphasize that point, I mean, it's critical to explain to people that all 3 are brilliant people and you need all 3. And they're different attitudes. You need to function, you know, have people who are excellent in all of those areas. And the second thing is
creative as well, Simon. I think that's,
and they are. Yeah, and the word innovation is such a terribly misused word, because people say innovation, they talk about Genesis. They use innovation for every feature product, innovation for every product, you know, product going to a utility model. So those are totally different innovations, but they use one word. It's like you may as well call everything cheese. You know, every word should be cheese. It just wouldn't be very interesting. The other thing is about self-selection, because you let people self-select, and then what they realize is actually I would be more comfortable over there. But you know, there's boundaries, and the wording has never been right anyway. But look, fascinating talk. But we have 3 to go through. So at that point, I'm going to take the ball and throw it over to Rosa. Rosa.
Let me share my slide. Can you see it well? Hello?
All good.
Yeah. Okay, so for those who came a bit later, let me introduce myself again. I'm a research fellow, a postdoctoral research fellow at the London School of Economics in the Department of Management, and specifically in the group of information systems and digital innovation.
I think you need to, Rosa, sorry, I think you need to switch the, we're seeing the slide presentation. You need to switch the displays at the top.
Oh.
So we get the other one.
Which? Yes.
I think go back to presentation mode, and then I think there's a thing at the top that says switch screens so that we get the presentation rather than the notes.
Well, to be honest, I was quite happy as it was. just go back to presenting. We're more than capable of coping. As I say, you know, we're all being invited into people's homes and everything else, so it's perfectly fine.
So I can. Sorry about that. We tried it, right?
No, it's perfectly fine. Rosa?
Yeah, I'm going to try instead
Okay.
to share my my PDF. So hopefully.
Okay. I'm going to say, Rosa, just ignore Alistair. I mean, it was perfectly fine. just go back.
Does this work better?
Try that one. Try that. Press that button there.
Yeah.
That'll do. That's perfectly fine.
Sorry. So
No need to apologize. Never.
Oh, hello. Yeah, information systems. Yeah. So I'm working in a research project, EPSRC research project, and as part of my research, as Simon was mentioning at the beginning, I've been studying Wardley maps. So even if the title of this panel was "Why didn't I learn this at business school?" I hope you allow me to change the talk and talk about what did I learn about Wardley maps at management school. That is as part of my ongoing research. However, let me briefly answer the question that we were given by Simon, because maybe a quick answer could be that if you have not learned Wardley maps at business school, maybe it's because you didn't come at the LSE, where my colleague Will Venters does teach Wardley maps in the Masters of Information Systems and Digital Innovation. He teaches in the most hands-on course, and Simon has kindly come to the LSE to teach students Wardley maps, specifically during their one-week bootcamp group sprint project in which they need to develop a digital solution for a real-world business case. I must say, however, that I've taught for several years at the LSE, and particularly I've been teaching research methods in management, and I've also been teaching the core course, theoretical course on information systems at the master's level. And in my courses, in fact, instead of trying to teach many models, techniques, mapping, what we do instead is try to help students develop critical thinking. And in fact, what we argue is that in that way they can make sense of what different models or techniques can and cannot do. Because at the end, sorry, I see something different than you. So because at the end, any theory or model or a map is a partial interpretation of reality that contains some implicit assumptions about what matters or not, and therefore in doing so they help us see some things while necessarily hiding others. So yeah, I've added here some representations, if you like, some visual explanations of what I mean. So a map can be a map of poverty, it can be a geographical map, it can be a worldly map, and indeed a map that would be perfect and that would try to capture everything would be reality itself, and that would be not a useful map in terms of interpreting reality, right? So the question for me is more, what does a specific technique or model or map, in that case worldly map, reveal, but maybe also hide, and why and how it comes to be used? And I will try to answer some of these in my presentation with the limited time I have. And my idea was to divide the presentation into parts. In the first part, the presentation relates more to the question of what is that worldly maps helps reveal, and more specifically, I will explain why worldly map attracted the attention of our research project. I will tell you a bit about the research project I'm part of, which is called IRIS, so Interface Reasoning for Interacting Systems. And therefore, I will try to explain how our interest in the study of interfaces, interfaces between systems, relates with our interest in worldly maps. However, in a second part of the presentation, I would like to very briefly, because there won't be much time, share with you some results of some research that I conducted with my colleagues, Will Venters and Mark Thompson, in which we studied the use of worldly maps, and therefore the mapping practice versus the map as a tool only. That maybe is more related to the first part of the presentation. So let me go to this first part. So what is the relationship with worldly maps and interfaces from our point of view? So about the research project I'm part of, Interface Reasoning for Interacting Systems, it's a project that is formed by a group of researchers in the computer science fields and various logicians from UCL, Queen Mary University of London, and Imperial College. And also, we are 3 researchers at the LSE from the information systems field. So we are mainly computer scientists. It's a big project, but 3 of us are more in the management side of things. So the focus of a study of this research project is interfaces, and particularly interfaces in distributed systems. This interest arises from the fact that systems are becoming increasingly complex and distributed, and increasingly organizations rely on systems architectures that go beyond their boundaries. Digital technologies, given their modularity, can be easily recombined, and so digital products and services also become the result of recombinations. So increasingly, we find that organizations leverage a range of external capabilities and assets which are available in the ecosystem. Therefore, we believe that in this context, ensuring the correct interaction between components becomes paramount. So in this sense, what we find is that worldly maps, nicely, in a sense, in line with our interest, help make sense of the complex landscape that we talk about, and these relationships between components. So in line with our project's research interest, we find that worldly maps encourages us to think in terms of components of a system that are necessary to provide value to a customer. So as you probably all know by now, worldly maps represents value chains anchored in user needs and takes into consideration the evolution or level of commoditization of those components. So in fact, our colleagues at UCL, who are logicians, are interested in developing a formal understanding of interfaces and distributed systems, have used worldly maps as an inspiration to develop a logic modeling of interfaces and distributed systems. It's one of the ways that they've been trying to think about what does it mean to create a distributed system that is robust. However, from the management side, from the more social science side where I belong to, we could argue that while maps make visible those interfaces, so that's what caught our attention, What we suggest from a management or information systems perspective is the need to open the black box of interfaces. So what does this line in Wardley Maps represent? And what are the challenges associated with managing those interfaces, those lines that appear in the Wardley map? We see interfacing, in fact, not just as a thing or as a boundary, but as a socio-technical process that requires work, negotiations, and involves certain commitments that one needs to be aware of. So some of the research questions that we are trying to answer in our research are of the sort of who defines interfaces or controls them, who sets the rules of interaction and exchange, and what dependencies might they generate. So what are also the capabilities that are needed to be able to interface successfully? It's not that you have an interface and things happen. Many times it requires some adaptation, some development of capabilities. So we have applied some of this research to some current research on the API economy that precisely focuses on this. By the way, if anybody is interested in this area, we are really interested in having contact with you if you have, as a practitioner or researcher, practice on this or travel with this. That's an area we are interested in studying. In addition, and that might connect a bit with the presentation of Marcus and what I was saying about the boundaries, we're also studying, we are conducting research in a big organization, and what we realize is multiple boundaries coexist within an organization. So this organization that we are studying has a wide range of client-facing projects. Each project is in a sense bounded, yeah? It has its own logics. However, various departments and people with different roles are involved in one or more projects with different levels of influence in decision making. So you have from the product development and the definition of user needs, the finance people, the marketing people, all them with their knowledge boundaries and also their priorities and interests, their assumptions of what is a priority, for instance. Moreover, as we know, budget is always limited and different projects and departments need to compete for the budget. So in that sense, yeah, as I was trying to say, so you have boundaries that are project boundaries, you have departments, so you have a range of boundaries within organizations with their own logics that compete. In addition, you have the IT architecture and the legacy systems that might require long-term thinking in contexts where usually short planning and kind of budgets for 1 year budgets become predominant. So in that sense, we realize that there are certain strategic tensions in how to take decisions and what kind of problems they manage to solve. Let me move, as I don't have much time, to the second part, the practice of mapping, and just very briefly refer to some of this research. We have published some papers with my colleagues, and it will be just a highlight of a couple of things that I find interesting. So our research, and maybe in the previous panel we talked about, what it shows is that mapping is an active doing and an ongoing process that typically involves various people. So in our research, we interviewed several mappers, several people using maps, some of them in this panel. And what several interviews suggested is that, in fact, the most valuable aspect of Wardley maps is the discussions that can be generated around the map. So in this sense, the value of mapping is in the process, not so much in the map as such. That's why striving for the perfect map is not only not achievable, but it's not even particularly desirable, because, as I say, it's opening up the discussions that many of our interviewees found helpful. So from our interviews, we can highlight some characteristics of how and why mapping is done in practice. So on the one hand, Wardley Maps helps making knowledge explicit, and that you could argue is an individual action, and in some cases it is. Sometimes it's used by individuals to make sense of this complex landscape. But in addition, what the many users of maps highlighted is that visualization, this characteristic of being a visual way of representing ideas, that is really helpful, because it can help express ideas succinctly, and above all, it can help with communication. So in a sense, one could argue that the map is like the models used by architects, in which they are allowed to make present in a room something that otherwise would be difficult to bring into the table for discussion. So in that case, a complex and distributed system that goes beyond the boundaries of the organization. In addition, communication facilitates collaboration. So most of our interviews, not all of them, but many of them, argued that the main value of mapping is gained by mapping in teams or by redoing maps, introducing the feedback from others. So even those that were kind of individual mappers, typically what they use the maps for is to show it to others and discuss ideas, strategic ideas, sourcing ideas, etc. So in this way, knowledge and expertise of various people can be brought together to make a somehow more complete map. But communication and collaboration shouldn't be seen just as agreement, because some of our interviewees mentioned that in fact it can be also helpful to show tensions, and therefore to try and resolve, to try to reach some negotiation points or reasonable points of agreement. As Wardley maps facilitate communication, another use that we realize is that it's used also as a legitimizing tool, as a way of convincing other stakeholders of the value of the ideas presented. So almost finishing, this raises the question of how is decision-making and strategic thinking developed in organizations, who is involved, which I find an interesting question. So firstly, Wardley map is expression of the increasing involvement of people with technical backgrounds in strategic decision-making, as technology is not just aligning to strategy, it's not just a second thought, but is increasingly seen as a driver, or at least as shaping strategy. Secondly, strategy and innovation are frequently presented as the achievement of single leaders, typically white and male, but I find that in my interviews, some of the ways, I'm not saying it's a majority, but I found inspiring that some of the ways in which Wardley maps was used was in terms of the adoption of more collaborative and inclusive practices of decision making and decision making and strategic decision making. So hopefully other people and organizations find inspiration in such practices. So to conclude, Wardley maps is useful to take decisions about sourcing and helps in strategic decision making, and that's why it's taught by my colleague at LSE, or why my research colleagues found it interesting to think in terms of how to represent distributed systems. But more generally, some reflections about the practice of mapping have to do with the role it plays in practices of sense-making and decision-making. As I mentioned, any technique or any map is partial, so it's worth considering what the map can reveal or not, and what is that you are trying to map, and what aspects the map might not make visible. For instance, I suggested, and it will be nice to hear what Simon has to say about this, that the need to consider how to manage interfaces and boundaries might become difficult to represent, at least in one single map. So the idea of maybe overlapping maps or using other techniques to think about bridging boundaries, or thinking about, as I say, the implications of interfacing, I suggest is worth considering. I have also highlighted that the need to think about the practice of mapping and not just the map, and the opportunities it might bring to do things differently and involve more voices in decision making, hopefully helping break some of the boundaries I was referring to before. And here I stop. Thank you.
Wow, fantastic. Hang on, I said I wasn't going to play around with my graphics at all, but I'm going to just have to go mind blown at this point. That was just truly fabulous. So many things to talk about. Striving for the perfect map is not only unachievable, but undesirable. I mean, what a standout quote that is. Technology is not just aligning to strategy, but becoming the driver. Okay, you asked some questions about the interfaces. One of the things I use maps for is obviously, once I have maps, is because they're maps of capital and you've got the interactions, the lines between them, is when I build cell-based structures. Of course, I'm cutting through all those lines. So that helps me define the interfaces for the actual cell itself. And then I'm applying attitude to it as well. That may be partially where you're going, but fascinating, just really absolutely mind-blowing stuff. So Alistair, Marcus, do we have some questions?
Yeah, so thank you, Rosa. I got from this that you were talking about distributed knowledge is a way you bring that into a map, and then therefore you can challenge the assumptions. But you also spoke about mapping distributed systems. And I remember you spoken before about, there's the X and the Y axis, and you also started to explore a Z axis. So have you made any progress with that? And does that actually help the idea, what does mapping need to evolve into to be able to map those distributed systems much more effectively? So it's bringing in, what about taking out?
Yeah, it's interesting because as you can see, thank you very much for the question. And I can see you remember my previous presentation last year, the ubiquity part that some people found like, wow, another dimension to Wardley maps is going to kill us. To be honest, recently, I think we've been following up more what does Wardley map tell us about our interest about interfaces. So I guess that, to be quite honest, we've been thinking more about that. So maybe it's about what it can tell us and not tell us. I find interesting that indeed, it seems I'm quite interested in distributedness. Indeed, I think we live in a world that, because of internet technology and in general digital technologies, have allowed all this distributedness to be possible. And I think one of the big questions for technological and social questions have to do with how to manage this complexity, issues of governance, and in that sense, I find interesting that our project, even if it comes with a very technical background, as I say, even the principal investigator of our project comes from computer science, and they're interested, they understand systems probably more in the computer science perspective. I see interfaces as opening lots of questions that are social and technical. So that's why my question before, I said maybe you will understand why I'm asking you this question in relation to my talk now, has to do with interfaces and boundaries are part of the way we organize. So we have doors, we have translations, we have many ways in which we manage to communicate and overcome boundaries. And I think the more we construct complex systems in which we need to bridge knowledge, we need to bridge systems, it's interesting to focus on that, because in a sense, that's maybe my main message that I want to throw today, maybe, is when we have a map and we say, okay, we have this component and it just connected. What does this mean? What does this connection involve? Is it that easy? Are there other boundaries that are either knowledge boundaries, other project boundaries, but also who has the control? Who has defined this interface? As in, who has defined the rules for the relationship? Who will hold, responsibility for certain things or others? What effort do you need to make, or what capabilities as an organization you need to develop to be able to communicate with another system, use another resource, etc., etc. And I think that cannot be taken for granted, and it requires work. So maybe that's where our thoughts have been going.
Okay, communication does require work. It's critical in a complex system. That's the interactions between things. Interesting topic, definitely. Thank you.
Yeah.
We've also got a question in from the audience. Hang on a second. This is from Wuta. Have you considered that the maturity axis on the map Is there a maturity axis on the map? It's evolution. But anyway, can be thought as the stability of the interface. For a commodity item, the boundaries are well understood. For a Genesis item, we don't even know what it should be doing, which is the process of evolution. I personally find that maps, as they are, offer a lot of insight on how to manage interfaces. Thoughts on that?
Interesting. Well, maybe I would like to talk to you later and tell me more about your views. Yeah, interfaces are very much also about standardization, and in a sense, standardization might lead to certain stability as well, can help with this. I think that there are other questions that, for instance, have to do with control. So is it, I know standards are about interoperability, about integration, but what about who controls and what are the commitments that you are making once you decide to interface? You might be inspired by Wardley maps because you see the interface and you think about it, but what I'm saying is not obvious. There might be just a line that you have not considered what this line involves. But I've not thought in terms of the commoditization of interfaces, so that's kind of an interesting point that I will think about. Thank you.
Cool, excellent. Well, thank you, Walter. Alistair, any thoughts on this one?
I was just going to, I guess, comment on the last point. I don't know that it's not necessarily the stability of the interface, but there is something about how complicated it might be. It's very unlikely that you've got a very complicated interface in a Genesis component. But whether or not it's stable, I don't know. You might be able to create something fairly simple from the get-go and it stays pretty much the same. But it's likely that the inertia and the complexity of the interface is capable of increasing by the time it gets to the industrialized region, as it were. I guess my question was whether there are sort of there are lots of publications you mentioned, and I apologize, I've only read one of them. But are there kind of key insights that the work draws out that aren't, for example, in people's reading of the Medium blog / book? Are there key things in there that you think people should grasp that aren't perhaps espoused by Simon in the non-academic setting, so to speak? So it's interesting about, we were talking about communication and boundaries and so on, and you are also academics, and you know how it is when you try to publish something in an academic journal, you have to engage on the debates on the academic discipline. So I guess that our effort is trying to bring together debates in the academic literature with what we have learned from Wardley maps. In a sense, I didn't go on into our last version. We are rewriting one of the papers that we have published on Wardley maps. We are rewriting it, and we are in the review process for a journal. And there we are focusing more on issues that have to do with what does it mean to make sense, and what does the object of the map and the practices in which it is part of, what does it mean? So we use a theory about performativity. The idea that the map is not just a tool that is kind of inert, it does something. So something we explore a bit more, I just kind of said it very briefly, but it's this idea of the almost like the architectural model, that it's almost like a boundary object that allows you to discuss ideas, and it makes it present. However, this making present is not a neutral making present. Yeah, there are many ways in which a representation can be done, and the fact that you show certain things and not others, it has consequences. So yeah, in a sense, I guess that what we do in the version of the paper that we have not published yet is that we go more into detail, trying to discuss how practices of sense making and strategizing happen. So it's more than saying why is it good or bad, it's trying to explain what does it mean to make sense through mapping.
Making sense meaning through mapping. Fantastic. Thank you. That was a wonderful talk. Now, finally, our last speaker. Gosh, Alistair, how long have we known each other? It feels like ages. I'm delighted you're here, by the way. I'm really delighted you're here. So let me take the ball and throw it over to Alistair.
Let's see what happens. Can you see that?
Yep,
Yes,
looks perfect. Thank you.
So, you know, why didn't I learn this at business school? I guess to a certain extent, it depends when you went to business school, because I guess I have taught it at least 2 business schools for a little while now. I was asked the other day why I came across Simon's work, and I literally have no idea. I think it was Twitter or the blog originally, but I've been fascinated by it ever since. So I've done a fair bit of classroom teaching with it, but I should say from a sort of pedagogy perspective, it is quite different because most business schools are sort of taught on a case study model about things that had happened. And one of the strengths, not that you can't use a map for teaching a case study, but one of the strengths of it is forward looking and thinking how things might change in your, you know, specific context. And therefore I feel like it is a slightly different approach than is taught elsewhere, and I'd be interested to know whether other people have got other views on that. And I guess also a little thank you to Simon, because you can see I teach I guess systems design, things like machine learning, and there's a lot of slides in there that you will recognize if you've waded through chapter after chapter online. In terms of like sort of day to day, I guess mainly because I do mainly work in machine learning at the moment. I guess I do quite a lot of Wardley maps, essentially of models or flows of information, and I found it very useful for you know, explaining to people the difference between sort of learning and prediction loops. And actually, the first time I've sort of tried to publish what amounts to Wardley map in anger is on the right hand side, which I've only submitted last week. But these kind of data set task engine chains are quite difficult to explain to people. They're quite, and as you get kind of engine dependencies and data set dependencies, actually I found the Wardley map to be a very useful way of teasing apart, you know, exogenous data sets and, you know, where fits to where, etc. So I'm a sort of practitioner in some sense. And then most of what, you know, well, not most of what, but what we've heard a lot today, and I would sort of concur, is that you know, the role of iteration and the value of them in communication. So this is, you know, I guess a startup company that I work with, version 2 to version 4, and I guess this is probably 18 months ago, and I think we might be on version 12 now. But you know, it's a very natural artifact to work with someone and iterate with. Almost regardless of the function within a business. And I guess it's in the context of strategy where the map is in principle, you know, most useful. Although I'd say actually using it in anger, I haven't used the map for genuine strategy in lots of scenarios. It's enough to get the landscape. But this is a piece of work I did with Mishcons and the Land Registry. We've already seen one speaker, Mark, who worked at the Land Registry before, but thinking about the strategy of how you transition from one system to another. And you know, the Wardley map unfortunately doesn't make it into the white paper, but there's lots of Wardley maps of stuff that have gone in the background and haven't seen the light of day. So I've been practicing it for several years now, and teaching it, I guess, for the same. I've been teaching it as fast as I can learn it to a certain extent. So I wanted to talk about map, you know, a map as a source of information. And whilst I don't disagree on, you know, the sort of social practice of mapping and the fact it's about the mapping and not the map itself, you can take that a long way, but we probably can't take it the whole way, which is if you're on one end of the spectrum and the map is a poor map, and you know, or not particularly well verified, etc., then you're still in the world of narrative in terms of sort of X marks the spot. And you know, the maps that we use in every day are quite complicated. They show lots and lots of layers of information, and it's the layering of different sorts of information, that kind of holistic presentation, that makes Wardley mapping so powerful. The fact that I can see different capital flows with different states of evolution or maturity of components, with the teams that work on them, with different skill sets over time, etc. I mean, that's the reason it's such a fascinating framework because it manages to, in a fairly compressed, coherent way, get all of that information in. But I guess we're going to talk about a little bit about how do we go from the narrative end of the spectrum of maps to the I guess empirical data-driven end of the spectrum of maps. And we have been doing this for a while. This is one of the earliest things that I've come across in terms of a metric map from the 11th century. This is the two main rivers in China etched into stone with a grid. And it's this notion of a grid or uniformity or normalization of the map that I think is most fascinating, which is a little bit I was going to talk about. And just to say that, whilst it's very good having simple maps, it depends on what you're trying to do, right? And if you don't really want a terribly simple map, if it means that you might end up crashing into an unseen archipelago or something. So I think we should hold on to, as a community, we should hold on to the notion that maps might be very complicated, and whilst there's a learning curve, as it diffuses as a practice, getting other people to understand it might get easier, and more complicated maps might get more and more useful. The other thing I was going to say is most of the maps, or most of the network diagrams that you come across are embeddings. They're all embedded in physical space. So we've got a network map of France looking at communication routes, which is embedded in a sort of 2D physical space. And to pick a completely different network, we've got a food web of fish in the North Atlantic, which is a different type of network. And in this case, it's embedded in another 2D spatial space. So at the top, we've got the air, and we're looking at a cross section through the depths of the ocean. And if you look at another thing that's interesting about Wardley map is there are remarkably few, if I skip forward, there are remarkably few network visualization methodologies where there is an embedding that isn't physical space. And when we talk about Wardley mapping, we're sort of embedding in this evolution, for the sake of argument, on the x-axis. And we'll come back to that. But if I look at the variety of methods out there, they seem to be underrepresented. Here you've got sort of 50 business networks, 50 visualization methods of business networks, and most of them aren't embeddings in some meaningful way. And there is some precedent for this. So this is we've already heard about mapping skill sets or social systems, and there's this work on sociometry that goes back into the sort of 1930s, and this is a sort of Wardley map version 0. At least it's got some shading as well, depending on the different stages. But this is looking at the relationship of pupils within a classroom, for example. So there is some background in embedding networks, but there seems to be precious little. Again, I'm really interested if other people have come across stuff. I just can't find a lot of precedent for it. So some comments on this, on the sort of embedded space. So we've got the x-axis, which we've got as evolution or maturity, depending on how we measure it. And the first thing I sort of note, I think, is I tend to get rid of the arrows, because what we've done is these are finite, limited axes that are basically normalize over the state of the system. So the component here gets normalized over its duration, and there's some detail in the Medium book about how to normalize the state of a component looking backwards. But implicitly what's going on here is you're also normalizing for time. So time is normalized on the x-axis. And there's an assumption that by and large, the position on the x-axis can be treated independently. So we don't think necessarily about the components being positioned relative to other ones. We think of them as standalone. Now, it's not strictly true, because normally we've got kind of sets of components. Here on the left-hand side, I've got this kind of a main assembly or a collection of components. And in principle, the sort of main assembly of sets of components gets more complicated as you go left to right. And and therefore, implicitly the normalization on the x-axis, it can't really be done at a component level. It should be done across components. But as a first approximation, it's quite easy. That's not the same for the y-axis, because the y-axis in the value chain is sort of implicitly ordered. Now, how we come up with an ordering is a sort of open question. But you could do some sort of maximization of flow type calculation to pick a particular ordering. But it means when we do the normalization, if we think about how we go order the components top to bottom, the movement of one component sort of necessarily alters all the other components. And so the normalization on the y-axis, if you've got one, for the sake of argument, is slightly more involved. So I was going to talk a little bit about how you might do that for certain types of information. In this case is citations. And so overall, y-axis normalization, we have to take into account the state of all nodes rather than just this, or all components rather than a single component from the start, which makes it a bit more awkward. So if I could hopefully persuade you of the importance of measuring or trying to measure something when we construct a map, then what can we measure? And I guess another thing that I've found really motivating, for want of a better word, in Simon's framework is this idea of using documents, or the way things are referred to, the language that's used, as a measure of their state of the world. And I think it's interesting. Again, it's not in as many places as you might expect. And so I guess when I was thinking about what I could meaningfully do outside of using Wardley maps as a practice, I kind of started thinking about this area up here, this uncharted space where we're building on top of incumbent systems and thinking about what sources of information there might be to sort of map in an empirical way this particular part of the state of a system. And I've been thinking quite a bit about citation networks. So how can you think about the maturity of a system that might turn into something commercial at some point? And again, if you look at citation networks, most of the time they're explored, it's the network topology itself that drives the embedding, not putting the network into some embedded space. But and another thing that's, when you look at citation networks, they tend to be temporal. So one thing that we're interested in, or at least I'm interested in, is looking at temporal graphs and how citations evolve over time. And in the same way that time is normalized on the x-axis, because something has to start created somewhere and has to move forward, to a certain extent, in a slightly different way, time is normalized in the y-axis for the most part as well, in the sense that you can't build a component on top of something that doesn't exist, and therefore there's a sort of temporal ordering to the y-axis. Obviously you can insert components underneath, etc. But again, in principle, in the technology, the y-axis is temporally ordered, partially ordered. And so I've started thinking about how you would do this for citations, and so you've kind of got a temporal ordering of citations in the y-axis and a temporal ordering in the x-axis. And the way you do this across a whole Wardley map might vary considerably in terms of different capital flows, but you can sort of renormalize the position of the citation based on how well it's kept up, or how well it's anchored. Not just the anchor of the map, but how components maintain their relevance. And so, in the book, Simon talks a little bit about the death of a component by it dropping off the bottom. And we've started to sort of instrument this a little bit so that your space becomes essentially a normalization of a load of point measurements, and you end up with a field. And the thing that a Wardley map is doing is sort of normalizing this field, which makes it a slightly peculiar artifact because it normalizes in both x and y at the same time. I don't know if this is going to work, but so this is pretend data. I was going to hope to do real data, but just to give you an idea of an animation of the sorts of dynamics of things that would appear on a real data-driven map over time. And there's all sorts of things that you can do. you might not be able to move down and to the left, but you can move left and to the right, depending on the structure of the system itself. These are the kinds of things I'm interested in exploring. And then to sort of wrap up, mapping high dimensional spaces is not easy. We take it for granted, but here you're looking at a point cloud of a forest corresponding to, part of an ordnance survey map with a path through it. And you can see that, understanding what is the tree and what is the path, in cross section might seem sensible, but the map itself obviously has representations that are not from the same measurement process. The map is constructed of all sorts of measurement processes. No one's claiming that the big blue P, is representative of that particular measurement process that positions the forest. And I think that, ultimately, this is a two-dimensional map of the state space of an Atari game. It's a DeepMind Nature paper. But if we could build up layers and layers of different measurements, then it might be that we can start to think more seriously about computational strategy, because we would have an awareness of the landscape. So in concluding, I very much like Wardley maps. I'm getting better at using them, and it's taken me a little while, so persevere if you're starting the journey. I think the machinery of a Wardley map in terms of a dependency graph and an embedding is a very well understood sort of set of tools, and we should be able to get better at them, and there's lots of work to be done. I can go back into it. These are the kind of workflows we've got at the moment, so graph databases, and increasingly using JSON formats and graph libraries to sort of build graphs. For some of the work, these are really complicated pipelines. I'm not going to talk about them, but they're there in the slides if people want them. This is a simulation, 1,000 node model. But where are we going to get the contours of the landscape from, right? We need to start to build useful maps that can be the precursor for the sort of strategy or executive work that might be built on top of it. Most of what I'm doing now is in kind of animated, essentially, so that you can go between different time steps. There is a blog which I said I was going to write and have not done very much on. It's been a slightly peculiar year, but I will update it in due course about various different bits or aspects of the map that I've got to grips with. And I also heard about active live maps and Death on the Vine, and I've decided probably my largest contribution today to accelerating Death on the Vine is being able to do it in LaTeX, for those of you that know what LaTeX is. So that's the conclusion of my talk. Why didn't you learn this at business school? And slightly facetiously, but in honor of a new Nobel Prize winner, the only other thing I've come across which has got kind of different normalizations in multiple directions is a Penrose diagram of the universe and black holes. So I will leave you with that thought. Simon, and into another black hole and over to you.
Wow, absolutely. I've got to go and do the mind-blowing thing again. Fantastic. So look, when I started mapping, I assumed everybody learned how to map at business schools, and I had done an MBA, and so I needed a way of describing the landscape I was in. So it took me at least 6 years to realize that other people weren't actually mapping, which I found somewhat perplexing. But the maps, I described them as Babylonian clay tablets because my maps are unbelievably primitive. I mean, I talk about, even the value chain axis. It's just, for me, it's more scaffolding because the chain is actually described in the map itself. So there are many, many problems and faults and weaknesses. They're very, very imperfect. I'm just amazed to see the work that you're doing. In fact, the work you're all doing, because hopefully out of this sort of process, we'll get a better map. And because ultimately, at the end of the day, a field only survives if people progress it. So eventually, my maps will be like, oh God, look at those! They're so primitive. Can't believe people used to use those, and that's how it should be. Any questions for Alistair? Marcus, Rosa.
I would have a question. I guess it strikes me coming, as I guess, more from the social science part, and having mentioned this idea of the imperfect map, that is how it is. And I would say I didn't go very much into discussing this, but I think it has to do with the social nature of innovation as well. So this evolution, while useful to think about, it is not, I would never see it as a kind of perfect, exact science to define at what level of evolution something is. So I would like to understand better, Alistair, where does kind of precision to imperfection, how does this connect? And maybe another way of asking it, what do you see the purpose of measuring and looking for precision in Wardley maps?
So I think 2 points. One is obviously when we started mapping, they were a lot less precise than than they are now, right? And the utility has gone up as the precision has gone up. So it's likely that lots of systems that we might want to measure, you know, some in some way, shape, or form will be possible. And then I guess there is I guess 2 points. One, even given that progress to mapping, you know, the maps are still wrong to a certain extent. The public footpath is not necessarily where it says it is on the map, and et cetera, et cetera. So, you know, nothing that we've learned over the last X hundred years has improved the absolute, you know, utility of the map outside of the context in which it was built. And it might be that these types of systems are particularly difficult to map because, you know, your forest isn't moving its boundary every year dramatically, etc. So it might be that the update and the affordances from the sort of hermeneutic properties of the system mean that these things are just very difficult, or parts of the system are very difficult, and the event horizon for certain parts of the map again are, you know, very difficult to understand. But it seems to me that it's certainly possible to find parts of the map that are, you know, stable and measurable, and you can start to build off them as we get better at it.
Marcus, did you want to jump in at all?
Less a question and more a comment, but I think it was important because I keep hearing this, I think, as Alistair referenced as well, it's not the map, but the mapping. And so I like the, you know, well, sort of, but especially now we're kind of in lockdown, because having a map is a fantastic way for distributed teams to be able to have something as a common reference point. So all talk about mapping is the process of putting things in a map, which is kind of together. I know somebody asked on an earlier session I was looking at, is anybody doing it online, which is what we've had to learn to do now. But it's not just about getting people together. It's about having that artifact that enables you to have these discussions when we're trying to work out how to work when we're not seeing each other in the office. So if I was to say that, I would agree with Alistair, but I would also go on and say, well, it's not just the map. The really valuable thing in Wardley's work is the strategy cycle. It's the mapping is a way to actually enable you to get round that cycle so you can start to manipulate it. That's what we focus on. And that's something that perhaps I would, if I was doing the talk again, I would focus on that bit, because that's the key bit to all this.
Okay, so on that subject of manipulation, which is a particular topic I have an interest in because of one of the questions from Jonathan. It was actually to Rosa, but I'm going to open this up. Is on the complexity of social media systems and how they affect social sentiment, and how we might start to address the problems that social media has started to service. Because obviously we've got industrialization of radicalization going on online. Have you used any mapping to explore those social systems?
So, I mean, almost is the answer, actually. So I've started quite a lot of work on mapping the legal system, because obviously I spend at least 3 days of the week in a law firm now. So we've been doing things like mapping the effect of the executive over time, basically using the structure of Wardley maps, looking at legislation. And we, on the list of things to do this year, is to look at I guess, a global or multi-jurisdiction, 10 jurisdictions, the legislation around hate speech and online manipulation of discourse. So I've done some on the legal side of things, and are just about to do a little bit on the, I guess, the monitor, the way society deals with this aspect of communication.
Rosa, have you explored that space at all?
Not any time recently.
No.
I studied a master's on new media, so I did write essays on participatory politics and use of social media. Back then it was a discussion that was starting, I think, when I was doing my master's, this idea that there are spheres of interest, and more it becomes difficult again to bridge boundaries between people with different interests, which of course is becoming increasingly obviously a problem, but I've not recently studied this, I'm afraid.
Okay.
I think I'd just say outside of the state, the idea of the Wardley map is very generic outside of the specific stages of capital. And so, I mean, using it to, look at citation networks or look at legal jurisdiction networks and things like that, there seems to be comparatively little work of thinking about embedded networks. And, it is an embedded network framework. So yeah, I think really early days, lots and lots of stuff to do.
Marcus, any comments on this?
Not really, no. Not on that particular question.
No problem at all. No problem at all. Okay. So another question. This comes from Andy. Are there any topological concepts in the mathematical sense that don't seem to translate well to Wardley maps? Gosh, that's a tough one.
I would say no. I think most of the machinery that I've come across, or at least have experience of, is available to a Wardley map in that sense. So, I mean, a 2D embedding of a network. The question about the interesting thing, I guess, from my perspective, also is that it isn't data driven in that sense, which means that you've come up with a representation that is an artifact that can be used for communication across all levels of an organization. Like, the exciting thing I find is that we could somehow marry the two up a little bit, right? Because you could go from purely data-driven topologies, in an embedded space through that, for the sake of argument, X percentage of people won't grasp because they won't have been educated in how to interpret them, through to something that you can pick up, but to a certain extent in an afternoon, right? It's taken a lot to get used to, and so perhaps it isn't exactly an afternoon's learning, and it certainly took me a lot longer than an afternoon to read the book. But the nodes and edges and scribbles on a piece of paper that looks like a noughts and crosses game is, in principle, a concept open to everyone. So no. I think that most of the mathematical machinery we have will, copies across in that sense.
Okay, so I suppose we've got a minute left. We do have more questions, but I remember there's always the networking lounge that people can go and join us in the archway. I suppose I am going to ask each of you if there was some key message that you would like to leave this session with. What would it be? What would you tell everyone? And so we'll go in running order. Marcus.
Okay, so I think there's an old expression which is that in the valley of the blind, the one-eyed man is king, and I think that goes into the idea. I think it was Alistair said earlier, if you started mapping, keep going, even if they're basic. Being one-eyed in the valley of the blind is going to be an advantage. But I think just remember that the map is to get you around the strategy cycle. It's a tool to enable you to understand what's going on and to act. So that would be the thing that I would suggest taking away from this.
Thank you. Wonderful. Rosa.
Another one would be maybe instead of only thinking about tools, resources, components, think in terms of processes and practices, because those affect how this can connect or not connect. And secondly, but I've repeated already this several times, think about boundaries, where those boundaries are and what are the consequences of those boundaries, and do you want to bridge them and how? So think also about interfaces and interfacing.
Thank you. And finally, not least, Alistair.
So I think two points. One, if you are starting this journey, just start anywhere. It doesn't matter, and iterate, because it becomes a lot easier the more you practice. And if you are a long way down the journey, don't be satisfied with constructing your maps from anecdotes. Let's make a concerted effort to figure out how we could build some aspects of this using data.
Fabulous. So overall, do we think there's going to be more maps in business schools? Yay or nay?
Most certainly, I think.
Hopefully. We'll find out.
We need to overcome inertia. That's the common answer.
Inertia. That's an entire whole new discussion. But at that point, we're out of time. I'm going to say thank you so much for coming along to Map Camp. It is wonderful to see you all. Fabulous. I mean, that hour and a half has just flown by. I really, really enjoyed this. And so a big thank you from me to all of you, and thank you to the audience as well. I hope you all enjoyed that. These videos will go be put online on YouTube. There was a question about slides. Are you all okay to share? Yeah, we'll get to slides as well. So that's the end of the session. Just a big thank you from us to all of you. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Bye.
Bye.